Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. You may have noticed I've been wearing this t-shirt recently, off and on anyway, and that is a tribute to Red Rosa Luxemburg. I feel close to her for a number of reasons. First, she was a brilliant woman. She had a doctor in laws degree, which is actually 2 degrees higher than the common U.S. law degree, which is the J.D. Now, can you get a doctor of laws degree in the UK, in the US too, rather? Yeah. You get a J.D., Juris Doctor, then you get a Master of Laws, and then you get a Doctor of Laws. What we used to call the LLB, which was the Bachelor of Law degree, is now called the JD. Now, whether there were any changes significantly to the degree from LLB to JD, I don't know. But I do know that there are 2 law degrees higher than the JD. And that is the degree that Rosa had. She was arguably the most educated woman in Germany. Extremely educated woman. She was born into a German-speaking family in Poland and then migrated to Germany itself. And I love her. She was assassinated in the same year, 1919, that my father was born in. So I just wanted to begin with that tribute to one of my great beloved beings, the great Red Rosa Luxemburg, someone whom I wished that I could have met. But unfortunately, at she probably would have been, I guess, my great grandmother. I imagine. Yeah, great grandmother sounds about right. But I still love her and I have tremendous affection for her. She was killed about when she was in her late 40s, I believe. And so that's like 20 years younger than I am now. What a shame. That just a tragic loss for the planet. Let me get on to the topic that I wanted to discuss today, and that is NATO. NATO was started as an organization designed to protect the West from the former Soviet Union. After the end of the Cold War, the Warsaw Pact, which was a response to NATO from the Soviet Union, ended. There is no more Warsaw Pact. There is, however, the continuance of NATO. And just in the last week, I'm sure you know this, but Sweden has been officially inducted into that organization. That seemed questionable for a while because some countries were not very happy about it. I think for good reason. They didn't seem to object when Finland's close friend, Finland, was inducted, but they did not want to see Sweden inducted, but now it is. So now 2 countries which were formerly neutral are now a part of NATO. Now, problem. There shouldn't be a NATO. There really should not be a NATO. NATO is a relic of the past. It is a relic of the Cold War. A Cold War which was started by the United States and the West. Stalin wanted to maintain a continuing relationship with the West because the Soviet Union had been partners with the West as one of the Allied powers during World War II. But the West said no. So when anybody asks you, if they ask you, who started the Cold War, the answer is NATO, and the US in particular. It was not started by the former Soviet Union. The fact that NATO continues to exist, and it exists, I think, primarily, as some heads of state have said, to act as a barrier to further expansions of Russia, obviously angers Putin. I mean, why wouldn't it anger him? It literally makes no sense for there to be a NATO anymore. There is no more Soviet Union. I would argue that many of the problems that we see in the world today are caused directly by NATO. For example, it was NATO that promised Russia that it would not annex countries which were formerly a part of the Warsaw Pact. Soon after that, NATO began to do precisely that. So all of a sudden, Russia has found itself surrounded by, I guess, enemies that used to be friends. Imagine if Russia somehow tried to establish a new alliance and got Canada and Mexico to join. How would the US respond? I don't even think that needs an answer, but I'll give you an answer anyway. Not well. The US would not like that. There would be massive threats. Whether that would do anything, I don't know, but I'm sure that Putin would not do something like that because Putin knows what the outcome would be. And in addition, why would Putin want to establish an alliance with Canada and Mexico? That would make no sense anyway. But that's the situation that Russia now finds itself. So Russia is now surrounded by, as I said, enemies that used to be its friends. Not a very good situation to be in. And so currently, two more countries. Now, these countries were not exactly friends of the former Soviet Union, although one was a bit, and I'll come back to that. Finland and Sweden. Now, Sweden was always neutral. Finland always maintained a policy of neutrality. For that matter, during the Cold War, so did Finland. But in the case of Finland, Finland had a very good relationship with the former Soviet Union. It had a good trading relationship. It was a very comfortable, friendly relationship between those two countries. And now all of a sudden, Finland, formerly a partner of sorts with the former Soviet Union, is now a member of NATO, which is explicitly an enemy of Russia. So if we look at the problems that exist in the world today and try to dissect them, I think that what we can see is that most of those problems, not all, but most of those problems are caused by the US, NATO, and the Zionist entity. That's where most of the problems in the world come from. And again, I'm not discounting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But again, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was done for a reason. Again, because Russia felt surrounded. Does that mean that Russia should have bombed cities and killed civilians the way it did? I don't think so. I don't like seeing civilians killed. But by the same token, that's war. That's war. Now, ideally, in war, you want to kill combatants. You want to kill people in the military. You do not want to kill civilians. And certainly civilians have been caught in Russia's war on Ukraine. So I am not happy about that. I feel very bad about it. I feel especially bad about it because my ancestry is primarily Russian. And so I feel some identity with Russia. And I feel really, really bad for countries which have been victimized by the lands of my ancestors. I don't want that to happen. I don't think that I'm responsible exactly. Obviously, I didn't do it. But I still feel some responsibility in a twisted sense, I guess, and that I wish there was something I could do. I really wish there was something I could do. But I wake up every morning and I read the headlines and I see what's happening in Ukraine. I see what's happening in Gaza. And I see what's happening with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I honestly have begun to become hopeless. And that feeling of hopelessness, I realize, is not isolated to me. Does that mean that I'm always depressed? No. I would make a distinction, at least for me, between hopelessness and depression. Hopelessness to me means that I feel powerless to bring about any changes in the world. It is simply a recognition of my inability to do anything. It is a fact. I cannot do anything. And I am the kind of person who, when I see problems occurring in the world, I want to help fix them. I realize I can't fix them alone, but I would like to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. Well, NATO is clearly a part of the problem. And this past week made that abundantly clear by accepting Sweden into NATO. That is a very tragic event, I think. What its consequences will be, who's to say? I have no idea. Maybe there will be no consequences. I guess we can all hope for the best. But NATO really has no business being around anymore. NATO is basically the bully on the block. Think of the block as the world. NATO was the bully on the block. And there really should be no bully on the block of the world. We need to, in the terminology used by Roy Bhaskar, establish co-presence or unity between all the nations and peoples and tribes of the world. Instead, we are seeing what Roy Bhaskar called demi-reality, which is the opposite of co-presence. Demi-reality was, first and foremost, Roy's translation of the Sanskrit Maya illusion, but to Roy, it also meant disunity or splitting, as I had mentioned before. And so to me, although on the surface, having Sweden join NATO might look like co-presence, might look like unity, one more country to add to the bully on the block, which is how I see it. In reality, it is demi-reality. It is a sign that the world as we once knew it. I was trying to think of how best to say that. I was going to say the world as we know it, but I think the world as we once knew it is more accurate. Does not exist anymore. Nor should we expect it to exist. I don't. I don't live in the past. I'm 68 years old, but I live in the 21st century. I don't live in the 20th century. And I realized that the 21st century is filled with a whole host of different problems than the ones that confronted people in the last century. But again, one of those problems, sadly, is that Sweden is now a part of that monstrosity of NATO, which should never have been formed in the first place. Rather, the US and the West should have accepted Stalin's invitation to cooperate. Now, I'm not a prophet, as you know, not a very good prognosticator either. So I don't know what would have happened had the West accepted Stalin's invitation. I don't know. Stalin was one of the allies, along with the US, in World War II, and Stalin had no objection to continuing that alliance, but obviously the US did. But at least if the US and other Western countries had accepted Stalin's invitation, the world would be different from what it is now. And the only thing I can think of is difference is what I want. To be honest, I sometimes don't even care what that difference is. That may sound odd, but I really don't. When the world gets so bad, when you see a country, Israel, the Zionist entity, destroy its colony of Gaza, and perhaps be on the brink of establishing a war, another war, with Lebanon. And Lebanon is of no match to the Zionist entity. There is no way that Lebanon can win a war against Israel. Simply can't. Doesn't have the militia. Doesn't have the power. Doesn't have the materiel. Nothing. So any such war will only be a war to the benefit of the Zionist entity. And that is really a shame. We do need co-presence in the world. Co-presence, which is a part of non-duality. The fact that we are all connected with one another. That does not mean that we are all the same, that we do not have our own individualities. Of course we do. But as individuals, we are still part and parcel of one another. And it is a shame that in the world today, especially with the fact that Finland has now joined NATO, that does not seem to be more universally recognized, even as most Americans oppose the war on Gaza by Israel. President Biden insists on going through with it. Why? I have no idea. Surely he must know that he is diminishing his chances of being reelected by doing that. Do I care? No. I don't care who gets reelected. I care about the advancement of communism. And I think that communism will originate in the third world. So what happens or does not happen to the US is irrelevant to me. I don't wish the US harm, but I also don't wish it anything. It's not in my field of vision. I don't think about it. Even though I live here, I should think about it, but I don't. So basically, I made this podcast in response to Sweden joining NATO and discussed other things that I thought were relevant or in relationship to that. And all I can say, as you have heard me say before, is that I am not a very optimistic person. But I don't want to depress you. I'm not depressed generally. I'm a pretty happy guy. But I have always been pessimistic since I was a kid. And I had good reasons to be pessimistic given how I was treated by other kids and my father. So pessimism was the natural outcome of my life. And so, in effect, I was socialized, conditioned into pessimism. Pessimism has been the spirit of my life. It has always been hard for me to be optimistic, always hard. And I try. I try. I try to look for good things, but I don't see any. I see possibilities, like with the third world rising up in revolution to establish communism or socialism. But that hasn't happened yet. And there's no guarantee that it will happen. Nothing in the future is guaranteed. What is guaranteed is the present. And the present is not very good. And that is what makes me pessimistic. Not that I believe that history repeats itself, but it rhymes, whatever that means. Even that it rhymes, I question. But history, the history of the United States, has been a history of expansionism, has been a history of war. The US is the only country to have used the atomic bomb on Japan at the end of World War II. And yet, we in the United States are the de facto leaders of NATO, an organization which has just accepted Sweden into its ranks. What a tragedy. And if any of you have the power to do anything, if any of you belong to any organizations which could put pressure on certain governmental or non-governmental bodies to bring this crisis to an end, I hope you do. I hope you do. But even that, I'm not optimistic about, because I have seen very little, distressingly little, to be optimistic about over the course of my life. I wish that were not true. But this latest thing with Sweden, for me, I was going to say has put the nail in the coffin, but Gaza did that already. But I guess this is an additional nail in the coffin to any promise of peace in the world today. There will be no peace, at least not for now. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.